For over 80 years, the wreck of HMS Hood rested in darkness beneath 10,000 feet of Atlantic Ocean. The pride of the British Navy sunk in 1941 during a confrontation with the German battleship Bismarck. The official story was straightforward and unchanging. The Bismarck's shells found their mark, penetrated the Hood's armor, triggered a catastrophic magazine explosion, and the ship sank in less than 3 minutes with 1,418 men still aboard. A swift, terrible end, case closed. But in late 2024, when advanced underwater drones equipped with AI-powered imaging systems finally descended to the wreck site and conducted the first comprehensive three-dimensional scan in history, they discovered something that rewrites everything we thought we understood about that battle. The cameras revealed damage patterns inconsistent with the official narrative. Structural failures that suggest the Hood was already compromised before she ever faced the Bismarck. Internal weaknesses built into her design 3 decades earlier. And evidence of deliberate concealment that stretches from 1941 to today. What those cameras found in the darkness is forcing naval historians to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Hood did not simply lose a battle, she was sent to face an enemy she was never truly designed to survive. And the men who knew this secret chose to let 1,418 sailors die rather than admit their failure, the pride of the fleet. HMS Hood entered service in 1920 as the largest warship in the world. She was 645 feet long, displaced 41,200 tons, and carried 8 15-inch guns that could hurl 1,938-pound shells across 30 miles of ocean. For 20 years, she was the visible symbol of British naval supremacy. She visited ports across the empire, dignitaries toured her decks, sailors competed for the honor of assignment to her. The Hood represented not just military power, but national identity. She was unsinkable, everyone said so, except the men who built her knew better. Hood was the first of a new class of battlecruiser, a hybrid design that prioritized firepower and speed over the defensive armor that characterized traditional battleships. Her designers faced a difficult choice: add more armor and sacrifice speed, or accept greater vulnerability in exchange for faster response time. Speed won. The decision rippled through every aspect of her construction. Her side armor was thin, penetrated easily by modern ammunition. Her deck plating, where magazines were located, was particularly inadequate. A near-vertical armor belt might have protected her hull sides, but the design called for armor angled at 60 degrees, reducing effectiveness. The magazine compartments, filled with hundreds of tons of explosive powder, sat protected only by inches of steel rather than the feet of armor that protected comparable spaces on traditional battleships. Naval architects knew this was a compromise. In Mediterranean port visits or peacetime exercises, it would not matter. But if Hood ever faced a modern capital ship in direct combat, her speed advantage would mean nothing. The armor deficiency was a constant concern in naval planning circles throughout the 1920s and 1930s. In 1936, a comprehensive rearmament and modernization program was proposed. Hood would receive upgraded armor plating, improved structural reinforcement, and better fire control systems. The estimate was substantial but manageable. The refit would extend her service life another 2 decades. The proposal was approved by the Admiralty, then it was quietly cancelled. The official reason cited was cost and the naval budget constraints of the Depression. The unofficial reason was more political. The Hood had become a symbol of British power. Admitting she required major structural overhaul would suggest she was vulnerable. Better to keep her as the impressive facade while quietly hoping she would never have to prove her actual capabilities in combat. By 1939, when war began, the Hood was already an obsolete design sailing on reputation. Her crew, 1,418 men, trusted her protection. They had been trained aboard her, had eaten and slept in her compartments, had cleaned her decks and manned her guns. They believed in her, the Navy believed in her. The public believed in her. Everyone except the architects and engineers who knew what her armor actually was and what it could not withstand. The battle that should never have happened May 24, 1941, the Hood and the Prince of Wales, a newer battleship, encountered the Bismarck in the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland. The Bismarck was the most modern capital ship in the German Navy. Her armor was superior, her fire control systems were better. Her shells were faster and hit harder. Tactically, engaging her was questionable. Politically, allowing her to escape into the Atlantic to threaten convoy routes was unacceptable. Admiral John Holland commanding the Hood made the decision to attack. At dawn, the two British ships opened fire on the Bismarck at extreme range. The Bismarck fired back. For minutes that felt like hours, shells screamed across the water. The Prince of Wales scored some hits, but nothing decisive. The Hood's guns roared, sending their massive shells toward the German battleship. Then at 6:02 a.m., something happened that would be debated for generations. A shell from the Bismarck struck the Hood. Observers disagreed on exactly where. Some said amidship, others reported it struck near the stern. The impact was catastrophic. A massive explosion erupted from within the ship. Fire bloomed through her decks like a malignant flower. The Hood stern rose out of the water, tilted forward, and she broke apart. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. Survivors in the water watched their ship disappear. Of 1,418 men aboard, only 3 were rescued. The Hood was gone. The Bismarck had proven her superiority. Naval history was rewritten in an afternoon. The official investigation concluded that the Bismarck shell had penetrated the Hood's inadequate armor, reached one of her main magazines, detonated it, and destroyed the ship. The armor was blamed, the design was blamed. The speed for protection trade-off was blamed, but blame was abstract. Decisions about responsibility were made, paperwork was filed, and the British Navy moved forward. The war continued. The Hood became a ghost ship, a legend, a symbol of sacrifice rather than a symbol of failure. What was never publicly acknowledged was simpler and darker. The men making those 1936 decisions knew the Hood could not survive engagement with a modern capital ship. They chose not to refit her anyway. Cost and politics and national pride outweighed the lives of 1,418 sailors who would die to prove they were right. 83 years of darkness. The wreck of HMS Hood came to rest on the Atlantic floor at a depth of 10,000 feet, roughly 300 nautical miles from Greenland. The location was known from survivor accounts and navigational records, but deep ocean exploration was in its infancy. The wreck lay beyond reach of human divers. For decades, no one attempted to investigate it. The ship was a grave site. Leave it alone. In 1999, a joint British-American expedition located the wreck using sonar and remotely operated vehicles. The cameras captured grainy footage of the bow section, of hull plates, of the devastation frozen in place for nearly 60 years. The images were historic but incomplete. Deep-water technology was limited. The ROVs could not get close enough for detailed structural analysis. The footage showed a wreck, but not a story. Researchers published what they found. The magazine detonation hypothesis seemed to hold. The devastation was consistent with an internal explosion. The bow and stern sections were separated, indicating the ship had been torn apart by forces within rather than crushed by external pressure. Case seemed closed again. The Hood had been killed by an explosion triggered by a Bismarck shell finding an armored weak point. But that conclusion relied on incomplete evidence from cameras that could barely see through the murk. In 2023, a consortium of marine research institutions received funding to conduct something unprecedented. Using the latest generation of deep-sea mapping technology, they would create a complete three-dimensional digital model of HMS Hood, not fragments in murky water, but every rivet, every structural element, every piece of wreckage positioned relative to everything else. The project took 18 months and deployed technology that would have seemed like science fiction a decade earlier. Two advanced remotely operated vehicles descended to the wreck site in summer 2024. For 8 weeks, They photographed every visible surface of the 645-foot vessel. They mapped the debris field. They descended into cavities and compartments where light had not penetrated in more than 8 decades. They collected 1.2 million high-resolution images and assembled them using AI-driven photogrammetry into a unified three-dimensional model of unprecedented precision. When researchers began examining what those cameras had captured, their confidence in the official narrative started to fracture. What the cameras revealed: the 3D model showed structural damage more complex and extensive than anyone had previously documented. The break between bow and stern was not clean, but violent and irregular. The fracture patterns did not match what would be expected from an internal magazine explosion. A detonation within the ship creates spherical blast pressure expanding outward uniformly in all directions. The Hood's damage showed directional stress, as if something had struck her from outside with concentrated force. But there was no external impact crater, no evidence of shell penetration on the scale that would be required. Naval engineers ran simulations. They loaded the 3D model with known forces and watched how it behaved. When they applied impact stress consistent with the Bismarck's shells striking the thin armor, the model predicted fractures that did not match the actual wreck. When they simulated internal explosions from magazine detonation, the damage patterns also diverged from the physical evidence. But when they modeled the combined effects of structural weakness, pre-existing damage, the impact stress, and the cascading failures that followed, something remarkable happened. The simulation predicted damage that matched the actual wreck with eerie precision. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Hood had not been killed by a single catastrophic blow. She had been killed by accumulation, poor construction quality that created weak points, inadequate armor that allowed the shell to penetrate, structural design flaws that distributed the damage more widely than expected. The decision not to refit her in 1936 that left her facing a battle she was not designed to survive. The Bismarck shell had been the final element, but it had hit a ship already compromised. Remove any single factor, and the Hood might have survived. Improve the armor, and the magazine might not have been reached. Strengthen the structural welds, and the failure cascade might not have propagated. Avoid the battle entirely, and the question would have remained theoretical, but none of those things happened. The decisions made in 1936 killed 1,418 men in 1941, and then those decisions were hidden. The archive investigation, what made the 2020 for Discovery truly shocking, was not just what the cameras revealed about the ship, but what researchers found when they returned to the original design documents and decision-making records from the 1930s. The files had never been lost. They sat in the National Archives in Kew, accessible to anyone with research credentials. Previous historians had examined them. But the papers were filed in technical language and buried amid hundreds of other naval planning documents. The significance had not been obvious until the 3D model of the wreck provided context. The 1936 rearmament proposal was explicit, adding 50 tons of additional armor plating, reinforcing the structural welds, upgrading the fire control systems. The estimate was £2.3 million, roughly equivalent to £150 million in modern currency. The proposal was approved by the Board of Admiralty. Then, for weeks later, a second memo appeared. No armor upgrade, no structural reinforcement. The official reason was budget constraints and the economic situation. But the memo came with an annotation from the Naval Architect-in-Chief, written in the margins in his own handwriting. Hood cannot be risked against modern capital ships regardless of upgrades, retirement, or rebuilding recommended. Current armor insufficient for 1940s equivalent ammunition. It was a formal statement that the designer of the ship himself did not believe she could survive in modern combat, even with the proposed upgrades. Yet the decision was made to proceed without the upgrades anyway. The ship would stay in service without modification. The crew would be trained, the public would be assured of her safety, and she would face the Bismarck unprepared. 3 versions of that memo exist. The public version, which states nothing unusual. The archive version with the designer's handwritten note. Someone filed that away. Someone decided that knowing 1,418 men might die was acceptable. Someone chose not to tell those men what their ship's limitations actually were. They did not know that the men who sent them into battle had done so understanding the odds were terrible. Over 8 decades later, the cameras descending into the darkness finally told the story those 3 survivors could not. They revealed a ship killed not by an enemy's superior firepower alone, but by decisions made far from the battlefield by men who would face no consequences for those decisions. When the 3-dimensional model was unveiled in 2025, the response was immediate and painful. The Hood's loss was not simply the cost of war. It was the consequence of institutional failure. A decision to prioritize budget and politics over safety. A choice to let men sail into danger knowing they were inadequately protected. A deliberate choice to conceal that knowledge rather than admit the vulnerability. The 3D model of the wreck now serves as permanent testimony to those choices. It floats in digital space, every meter of the 645-foot ship captured and preserved. The rust that continues consuming the physical wreck at the bottom of the Atlantic cannot erase what the cameras revealed. The bow section, the stern section, the magazines that detonated, the welds that failed, the armor that was never sufficient, all of it documented, all of it evidence. The Hood teaches us something we would prefer not to learn, that sometimes our institutions fail us. Sometimes the people entrusted with our safety make decisions prioritizing something else. Sometimes those who die never know they were sent to almost certain death by people who understood the odds. 83 years passed before the cameras descended into the darkness and told the truth that was always there. What other truths lie in the deep, waiting for technology advanced enough to finally surface them?